Afternoon and welcome. Buenas tardes con todos. I am Maria Rosa Vaquerizo. I'm the CEO of the Andean American Associations. Uh, these are the first chambers of commerce that were founded in the US for Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela. They were founded in the 1920s and 30s. Our associations are almost 100 years old, and they have hosted over 1,000 programs over the years. I want to give our great partners a warm welcome. Our partners are the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, represented today by Tatiana Miranda and Mauricio Weinstock, and the North American Chilean Chamber of Commerce, represented today by Manuelita Cody. So our webinar is Trump and Latin America, Implications and Opportunities. We are honored to have an extraordinary roster of speakers. We have Michael Stott, Latin American editor of the Financial Times. We have Luis Oganes, managing director and head of global macro research at JP Morgan. We have Alejandro Arreaza, Latin American economist at Barclays Capital, and our moderator is Kelly Librera, partner at Winston & Strawn. Let me give some special welcome to our attendees. We have a great roster of attendees. We have, the last time I saw, we have 220 registrants. So I would like to give a special welcome to Michael Skoll, president of the Venezuelan American Association of the US, and John Maisto, former ambassador of the US to Venezuela and to the OAS, respectively. Also, we'd like to welcome Carolina Barco, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia and former ambassador to the US. We have with us Leopoldo Lopez Gil of the European Parliament. In addition, we have Annette Rohr from Pichincha Corp. And some of our past speakers, we have Michael Shifter, past president of the Inter-American Dialogue. We have Sebastián Hurtado of Profitas, Santiago Mosquera from UDLA, Saúl de Real from Fitch Ratings, Jose Gonzalez from GCT. We have also with us today multilateral agencies. We have BLADEX, the IMF, the IFC, the UNDP, and the World Bank. Government representatives from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and the US. Rating agencies, we have Fitch and SP Global, and major banks, we have Asobanca, Barings, BBVA, BNP Paribas, Citi, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Ocean Bank, Santander, Sumitomo Mitsubishi, and UBS. Universities, we have the Iowa State, UDLA Ecuador, and media, we have Latin Finance. Just want to welcome all the participants. It's just such a great roster. Welcome, and thank you so much for your interest in our programs. And now I will introduce very briefly our moderator, Kelly Librera. She's a partner at Winston & Strawn, LLP, New York. Her practice focuses on complex commercial litigation. She has extensive experience representing insurance companies, financial services providers, and financial institutions in a host of complex disputes, civil and criminal investigations, class actions, and arbitrations. At any time, you can write questions via the Q&A button that you have underneath. At the bottom, you have that Q&A button, and you can write your questions. Kelly will facilitate at the end of the program. And now I give the floor to you, Kelly. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Maria Rosa, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in this fabulous panel that we have today on Trump and Latin America, the implications and the opportunities. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel here who can talk to us and give us their observations. And as Maria Rosa mentioned, we have the ability to post questions in the Q&A section. So please do so that we can have the benefit of the panelists' expertise at the end of the program. The panelists today that we have, Luis Ogañez, who is a managing director at JP Morgan, and he is the head of global macro research. He manages the strategy teams that cover rates, currencies, commodities, and emerging markets. Luis joined JP Morgan in 1997 in New York, and he currently works in London. On several occasions, he has participated in advisory projects with governments and quasi-sovereign institutions in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. Michael Stott is also with us today. He is the Latin America editor for the Financial Times, and he's now resident in Rio, Brazil. He was previously in Tokyo and London as the managing editor of the Nikkei Asian Review, a sister publication covering Asian business and politics. Prior to that, he was the Financial Times UK news editor. Michael reported from Latin America from between 1990 to 1998. He has lived in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. He was also the Moscow bureau chief and editor for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at Reuters, and joined FT in 2014. Last but not least, we have Alejandro Arriaza, who's a Latin American economist at Barclays. Mr. Arriaza is based in New York, and he's responsible for the firm's macroeconomic coverage of the Andean, Central America, and Caribbean economies. He joined Barclays in 2010 after working for several years in the financial markets in Venezuela. From 2004 to 2010, he was an economist at Bancaribe, the sixth largest bank in Venezuela, which is associated with Scotiabank. Prior to that, he worked in economics research for Santander Group in Venezuela. He's a regular contributor for CNN in Espanol and Bloomberg News. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Luis, who can get us started today.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm glad that distance is not preventing us from having this type of interactions and communications. Thanks so much for the invitation. A lot to talk about, certainly. It is a weird moment in time in economic history, in political history, in geopolitical history, I think, for the world. And markets, in a way, are reflecting that. A lot of uncertainty, very little conviction as to what may come next. And we are literally having this conversation a week away from, a bit less than a week away from the 2nd of April, which is now being termed T-Day, tariff day, when there's going to be more information as to what the policy intentions of the US are. And the reality is that as much as we're hoping that we will get clarity as to and get it over with, okay, this is what the US is going to be doing and imposing. The reality is that the story won't be over on the 2nd of April. Probably we'll get some headlines and some decisions, many of which would still be subject to negotiation or renegotiation, and potentially, taking some of them could be, taking a step back or postponed. So I think that this uncertainty is probably going to continue, and that obviously, will have a bearing on sentiment at the very least, and eventually, could start to show up in the hard data. So just to share with you, what is it that we're looking at right now in the U.S. economy before discussing, the Latin countries. In terms of where we are. The hard data in the US is not showing weakness just yet, although at least not to the point of saying that, hey, there's a possibility of a recession around the corner. The manufacturing data, the consumption data, the hiring data in the labor market, is still rather healthy. What is showing weakness is the sentiment indicators, business sentiment, consumer sentiment, and this is what has raised warning flags that if this uncertainty persists, if the Trump administration pursues policies that are seen, quote unquote, as aggressive, hitting tariffs, particularly on its main trading partners, Canada and Mexico, certainly that could push its neighbors into a recession. And given the integration, trade integration, manufacturing integration within North America, after 30 years of of the regional NAFTA agreement, recession in Mexico and Canada could certainly generate, at the very least, a significant slowdown in the U.S., if not a recession in the U.S. itself. That is partially seen in the weakness of the dollar of late, partially being reflected in the decline in interest rates in the long end, and the market pricing, a bit more almost like 3 cuts by the Fed. But again, uncertainty is still the name of the game. Some of these things, could certainly change in the days and weeks ahead and months ahead. So we don't know. Now, in terms of what to expect from T-Day next on the 2nd, next Wednesday, all kinds of scenarios, and we try to model what that growth impact would be depending on what the scenario plays out. And given that we don't know, and given that no scenario would probably be a permanent one, could still be, as I said before, subject to renegotiation, it's very difficult to come up with precise estimates as, okay, this is the impact if this scenario happens, right? But just to give you a sense, okay, what are the multiplicity of announcements that would come on the 2nd? Certainly there is the possibility of a universal tariff. During the campaign, President Trump spoke about 10% across the board, 60% on China. As you may know, before all this, the average tariff of the US on China was 20%. There's been 2 10% increases announced so far. So average tariff on China from the US has moved from 20 to 40%. So there's a question whether there's going to be some kind of universal tariff being applied on everyone else. Then you have USMCA. There's been a lot of back and forth, 25% between, from the US imposed on Canada and Mexico, twice announced, twice postponed. The postponement, the second one, is expiring as well next week. And the only thing that is applying so far is the tariff on non-USMCA compliant exports from these 2 countries to the US. In the case of Mexico, I'll focus on Mexico in a minute. Mexico certainly seems to be on the firing line of this whole dynamic within Latin America. 10% of Mexican exports are not USMCA compliant. Now they are already facing 25% tariffs. But, we have had this announcement on autos yesterday by President Trump that, and there's no exceptions apparently being considered. So, that would certainly hit the USMCA partners, quite hard, because autos has been part of the trade integration, manufacturing integration between the 3 countries, again, for 3 decades. Then there is talk that the tariffs will be used not only to offset or to reciprocate on whatever tariff countries impose on US exports, but also to offset or reciprocate or retaliate on whatever VAT countries charge on goods that are imported from the US. And this is a very draconian move because compared to the US, where a lot of the taxation, consumer taxes are, sales taxes that are imposed at a state level, and there's no VAT as such in the US, but many other countries impose VAT as part of, its taxation model. So it's not that they are singling out US products for VAT. So to compensate that via tariff, the tariff will probably be quite hefty, and it could certainly hit, many countries. I think the Europeans are certainly, paying close attention, nervous about this. But I think that the potential pain from that, would certainly extend globally, certainly for countries that do apply VAT across the board, including US imports. Then you have talk about sectoral tariffs, right? I mean, we already have aluminum and steel. There's talk about, imposing that on tech products, agricultural products, etc. So more to come. And there is the, just the pure reciprocal tariffs, right? If you impose some tariffs on the US is going to impose exactly the same amount on the country. Easier said than done, because the what is being exported and imported is not the same product, but there is talk of that. So what exactly will be announced next week? Again, anyone's guess. and we'll need to wait just to assess market impact. Very briefly on, doing a quick summary of what this means for Latin America. Mexico, as I said, is the country that is more in the firing line of all this. Already, our economists have downgraded Mexico's growth to zero. Only it was, I think, started the year around 1%. It's now at 0.4%, and this is just because of the uncertainty, right? Right now, given that we don't know exactly what is going to happen with tariffs, we don't know what is going to happen with the renegotiation of the USMCA that is supposed to happen in 2026, but it could easily be brought forward. Just given just to reduce the period of uncertainty, growth is suffering. But if depends on what happens next week or what is the final lineup of tariffs, certainly the risks on Mexican growth are clearly on the downside. To give you a sense, if there is a 25% on tariffs on autos being confirmed without exception, including Mexico, growth instead of being 0.4% positive could turn into negative minus 1.1%, so a decline. If there is a blanket 25% on all Mexican exports going to the US, the reduction in growth that our economies are estimating would be like negative 2.3%. So it's again quite dramatic, what the impact would be on Mexican growth. So certainly a lot to watch next week or in the coming weeks. When we do the same, and Mexico, because of the trade integration, as I said before, is the one country that is most vulnerable to this tariff dynamics, but it's not the only one. The rest of the region, with various degrees of vulnerability, would also face an impact. Let me just mention very broadly. In the case of Brazil, interesting enough, in the first government of President Trump, when there was this U.S.-China trade tensions and the trade war and the U.S. imposed tariffs on China and vice versa, actually Brazil benefited because a lot of the demand from China was redirected to Brazil, particularly commodities, some metals, some agricultural commodities. So it was a net beneficiary of, if you wish, of the U.S.-China trade tensions. This time around, we think that that's going to be less the case. Certainly, depending on what type of tariffs are announced next week, let's say that they do the calculation of tariffs based on VAT. Well, guess what? Brazil does apply charge VAT on imports from the US. The average tariff of that Brazil charges on US imports from the US is 10%. So, you could start adding and you could get, also quite a big hit. Now, the number one trading partner of Brazil is actually China, not the US, but it would still, potentially affect the US market. The estimate, if the US were to match that 10% with its own a tariff like that on Brazil, is that growth could decelerate maybe 0.3, 0.4%. For the other countries in South America that are exporting commodities, I'm talking about Chile, Colombia, Peru, you would have, again, various degrees of impact, but the issue there is that China is actually the main trading partner, at least for Chile and Peru. They don't export so much to the US, so maybe the growth impact they're not exposed, certainly like Mexico is, but for sure, any imposition of tariffs, a matching of VAT would still, put pressure on growth in these economies. Maybe the amount is lower than Brazil, certainly lower than Mexico. We're putting again, a 10% tariff applied on these countries, just to give you a sense of magnitudes, orders of magnitudes, maybe 0.1, 0.3%. Impact of growth. And here we're including Chile, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, and Uruguay, given the trade links with the US. Again, we can discuss a lot more. I'll stop here and I can try to address some of these topics in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I'll turn it over to Michael Stott now.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. Humbled by the quality of the audience. I'm sure many of the participants know much more than me. I'm speaking to you from Santiago, where I'm attending the IDB annual meetings. I think to some extent I've drawn the short straw on this panel because it's a lot easier to talk about the impact on Latin America, I think, than the opportunities for Latin America, but I will do my best to pick out some opportunities for you. I think too, though, that we should draw a distinction between the opportunities that there ought to be for Latin America versus the opportunities that are likely to be, because I think they're quite different. Luis has underlined the uncertainty, and I agree with him about that. I would say, though, that I think the signals so far from Trump have been pretty consistent, and those signals have been America first, second, and third, that President Trump wants products made in America. He has no time for products being made anywhere else. And the concept of nearshoring does not appear to figure at all in his rhetoric and in his approach. And I think at this point, it's probably wise to take him at his word on that. There are, of course, very sound economic arguments that we're all familiar with, that the US needs Mexico and to some extent Latin America to help it, but that this is a good thing for the US. It helps it compete with China, makes its products more competitive. It makes economic and geopolitical sense. I think many of us on this call understand and know all that very well. But I think what we have to remember is that we're now in an era of economic nationalism. And in an era of economic nationalism, those geopolitical and geoeconomic arguments are not necessarily the ones that prevail. I think there's a bit of a tendency at the moment in the international community to be reluctant to take Trump at his word, to sort of keep insisting this is all a bargaining tactic and that it'll all eventually get settled and go away, thinking back to his first term. I would caution there to everyone to think about Brexit, which was the very painful process we went through in the UK. Everybody made the arguments then that Brexit made absolutely no geopolitical or economic sense, that it would damage the UK economy, and that there was no upside in it for the UK or Europe. The British people nonetheless voted for it. It was implemented. We are now suffering the damage from it. And nobody at the moment in the UK government or opposition is seriously suggesting reversing it. So I don't think that's a good thing, but I think it's a salutary reminder of how we're in a different political environment now. And what makes economic sense doesn't necessarily make political sense. I think it's interesting to consider last night President Trump's announcement on the car tariffs. Straight away, the Auto Workers Union in the US comes out to praise it, salute it, talk about what a great thing this is, how fantastic it'll be for American car workers. We can all sit here and say this makes no economic sense. It's going to mean more expensive cars for American workers. But President Trump's already thought of that. He's offering tax breaks for people who borrow money to buy American cars, maybe financed partly by the tariffs. And so we're in a different sort of economic paradigm, it seems to be, in the US now. That almost certainly means, in my view, if it's followed through on, the end of nearshoring as we know it. That was supposed to have been one of the great opportunities for Latin America. I don't think in practice it ever went much beyond Mexico and Central America, but I think that opportunity is now looking very distant. So if we take this down to sort of opportunities and we try to look for some opportunities amongst this, I think it could be the shock that Latin America needs to push much greater regional trade integration. And this is probably the biggest opportunity. It's something that's been talked about for as long as I've been covering Latin America, and probably much longer. It's never happened, right? It's been stalled constantly. It's always been on the drawing board. Perhaps this time it might be the shock, this Trump shock, might push the region to really think it needs to make concrete moves towards greater regional trade integration. I think that's a big opportunity. I think for Mexico, there's probably a necessity, if the tariffs are followed through on, to rethink the economic model of the last 35 years, which has led to a very heavy dependence on the US market. And the north of Mexico has profited mightily from that model. The south of Mexico quite a lot less. But if the North American market really now is closing to Mexico, and Mexico is not going to be treated differently to other parts of the world, Mexico has to consider seriously, in my view, whether it needs to look more to Latin America in the first place, to Europe perhaps also, and maybe even to China. and rethink its entire economic model. So that's one question. And then I think for Central America, there's also a big question about whether nearshoring, the CAFTA-DR agreement, whether this is now something that's seriously wounded, or whether it still has a future. As Luis mentioned, there's a lot less impact for South America. Really, South America has not been mentioned very much by Trump. It's not really on his radar, and I think most South American leaders and governments are trying very hard to stay off Trump's radar. What else does it mean? I think it means that Latin America's got an opportunity to diversify its trade links, and I don't mean here increase the dependency on China. I think actually that China may benefit less than some people think. I think there's been a bit of a lazy default to just saying, this is all going to benefit China, this is music to China's ears, it's all going to fall into their lap. Sure, there are opportunities for China, but remember Latin America, particularly South America, is already heavily dependent on China. It's the main trade partner for most of South America. And certainly the government people I talk to in South America don't want to increase still further their dependency on China. They would rather diversify. So there's more of a tendency there to look to Europe, to the EU, to see whether the EU can really get serious about Mercosur. And let's face it, if with this whole Trump shock, if the EU can't get Mercosur over the line and get it ratified this year, then I think we can really forget about the EU in terms of Latin America. This is really the moment they have to step up. And I think the Commission knows that in Brussels, but some of the member states, France in particular, and Poland are still radically opposed to this deal. So let's see whether they can do the right thing and get serious. So the big question mark on Europe. I think there are opportunities too for Latin America and the Gulf. There's a lot more business and investment now coming from the Gulf countries, from Saudi, the Emirates, Qatar. They're extremely interested in food security, which is a terrific opportunity for Latin America. And they have the money to back that. They have the long-term view, the long-term interest in doing deals, securing access to food supplies in the long term. India is another opportunity for Latin America. There's been very little historic linkage there, but it's interesting to note, in Santiago, that the Chilean president, Gabriel Boric, is going to India soon. Southeast Asia, also, of course, an opportunity. So diversification, I think, should be an opportunity. And then there's the opportunity that there ought to be, but which has been talked about by some enthusiasts, but which so far hasn't materialized, which is the opportunity for the Trump administration to get serious about boosting the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, making that into a really strong engine to boost investment in Latin America. There's talk of doubling its budget. There's talk of changing its mandate so it no longer focuses on poverty and can lend more to middle-income nations like Latin America. If that were to happen, I think that would be a game changer. Clearly, people like Mauricio Claver-Carrón are very keen on this in the State Department, but I haven't seen any signs so far that President Trump is keen about this or has shown any sign of interest in it. Indeed, I haven't seen any signs that President Trump has shown any interest in boosting trade and investment with Latin America at all. He's talked really almost exclusively about boosting the US economy without a great deal of concern about what it means for anybody else. So I think we'd have to say that's a potential opportunity. There are clearly people within the administration who would like that to happen. But at the moment, the president has not yet shown he's behind that. And as we all know, this is very much an administration where the president's word is the one that really counts at the end of the day. So I think there's a question mark on that one. So to summarize, I'd say I think it means Latin America is largely on its own in this environment. Trump's focus is not on helping or boosting alliances. He's skeptical of alliances. He sees the world in terms of transactions and deals. He doesn't see a strategic need to create a strong and prosperous Latin America to benefit the US. He sees a need to secure the US through moves against some Latin American countries like Mexico, which is under heavy pressure on drugs in the border, or Panama, which is under heavy pressure over Chinese investment and Chinese ports in the canal. So Latin America is largely on its own. That doesn't have to be all bad, as I mentioned. I think it gives the region a chance to think about its own integration and getting serious about that. And I think the reason that might happen, or there's more chance of it happening, is not just the Trump shock, but the two leaders of the most important countries, Lula in Brazil and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, are actually both interested in this topic. And I understand that they're both talking about it, and they have a conversation, which is already a big change, because clearly, if you think of Mexico and Brazil before, there was really no contact at all between President López Obrador and President Bolsonaro. So you've got Brazil and Mexico starting to talk to each other a bit more, and both showing more interest in regional integration. So if they start to harness that and really turn it into a plan, then we might see things really changing there. A bit more of a question about Argentina. And of course, you've got opportunities there, if you like, of a sort for the two allies of the US in the region, the two obvious allies for Argentina and for Salvador. They're both clearly interested in leveraging their relationships with the Trump administration for their own benefit. In Salvador's case, it's the endorsement of the security policies, and now apparently renting out jails to the Trump administration, which Bukele is very happy about, President Bukele. President Milei clearly is eyeing the IMF deal and hoping very much the Americans will get that over the line. And if you believe Minister Caputo today, Argentina is about to get this IMF deal. The IMF so far as I've seen, haven't confirmed that, but Argentina clearly hopes for the IMF deal. But you have to ask what more they're going to get from that friendship with President Trump. As I mentioned earlier, it's very much about America for him. I don't see him making big moves towards trade deals with Argentina or pushing big US investment in Argentina. Elon Musk's admiration for Milei and their stunt with the chainsaw at CPAC, where Milei handed a chainsaw to Musk, didn't result in any investment by Tesla in Argentina, you have to say. So I think there are some questions about this ideological affinity, what it actually will bring at the end of the day to those allies. And then I think finally the Andean nations, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru are essentially in a bit of a state of flux pending elections. And of course, there much is going to depend on who is elected as to whether they're able to pursue a closer relationship with the Trump administration or turn their back completely, and also the extent to which they'll be interested in regional integration. So I suppose that's my sort of very quick run around the region in 13 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now turn it over to Alejandro Arriaza.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the Andean American Association for the invitation for this great panel. So I'm supposed to talk about the challenges that we have in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, and I think the uncertainty that both Michael and Luis mentioned in their introductory remarks is probably one of the first sources of challenges for the region, in the sense that this is introducing a lot of volatility and also could have an impact in terms of growth, affecting or at least delaying some investment and financial and consumption decisions across Latin America. No? I think another important issue is the alignment of the policy objective. No, if we see the U.S. Seems to have at least two priorities in the relationship with Latin America at the moment. One of them is migration, and the other one is trade. It looks to me that in this potentially conflicting objective, migration seems to prevail over trade, and in principle, our expectation is that the target of the sanctions that could be announced in the coming days could be focused or targeted mainly in the countries that have a larger trade deficit, or the U.S. has a larger trade deficit with these countries, no? Or those that could have larger non-tariff trade barriers, no? From that perspective, I think actually the region doesn't look in such a bad situation, in the sense that most of the countries or the U.S. has a trade surplus with most of the countries in the region, and the exception seems to be Mexico, that, as Luis mentioned at the beginning, is the country that seems to be more exposed from the trade perspective. No? If we move more into, let's say, national security issues, that seems to be another big challenge for the region and for the bilateral relationship. I think Venezuela probably stands up as a hot topic. We had this week the announcements of President Trump imposing a 25% tariff on countries buying Venezuelan oil and gas. I will say that this is probably the toughest measure that has been implemented on Venezuela since it was declared a national security threat for the U.S. in 2015 by then President Obama. And this measure is also coming right after the U.S. announced the revocation of the license to Chevron earlier this month. No? So the combination of these two measures could be, in fact, an oil embargo on Venezuelan exports. No? That could have a huge impact for the country. In practice, the government doesn't seem to have many options to caution the impact of these measures, and it could be forced to rely more in the trading or the commercialization of its crude through black markets, in which it might be forced to absorb a large discount that could be up to 30% of the value of the oil production, and it could also have some problems in the supply that generate bottlenecks that could force to shut down production for up to 400,000 barrels per day. No? So the mix of these two potential issues could cost Venezuela more than half of the country's oil exports, and are already having a very strong impact on the economy. No? In the last few days, the Bolivar has been plummeting. It is accumulating a depreciation of around 40% in just during this month, and the exchange rate has almost increased 150% over the last 9 months since the elections in July. No? So if these measures stayed in place, so there could be the risk of Venezuela even moving back into hyperinflation in the coming months. No? I think what we are seeing at the moment seems to weaken the thesis that President Trump could have some sort of quid pro quo agreement with the Maduro regime, in which Maduro could provide some contention of the migration flow in exchange for some sanctions relief and also some increase of the supply of oil towards the U.S. No? I think at least the latest signals are pointing into a tightening of the policy and an imposition of probably the most hawkish views within the Trump administration on Venezuela. And in that context, I think the perception seems to be that Maduro is the root of the problem, and still there could be as a policy objective another push to try to see if a political transition is possible in the country. I think still, I think the situation remains very uncertain locally in Venezuela, and the government doesn't seem or doesn't show big signals of giving a political concession, but that seems to be the key to have any contention of the measures that we have seen in the last few days. At least the concessions that the government has been given in terms of migration doesn't seem to be enough to reach a negotiated solution. Then if we move towards other countries across the region, we have Ecuador that also is facing big challenges. In that case, there has been also a close relationship with the U.S. However, the local elections could result in a weakening of that relationship if at the end we see a change toward correísmo there. No, in the case of Colombia, we had some tensions earlier in the year. But I think in that case, probably Colombia was not necessarily initially a focus of attention for President Trump. And it was more the provocations coming from Petro what led into an escalation of tension. But it looks like that has been contained at least for now. There seems to be understanding in the U.S. government about the political outlook in Colombia, in which seems very likely to be moving into a swing back towards the historically conservative roots that Colombia has always had, and that probably could be a factor also that helps to contain any action that will significantly affect the bilateral relationship in the short term. I'll stop it there, and then we can go into more details in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Alejandro. We'll move to the Q&A portion of the program. And Alejandro, this is probably a good question for you to start with, and then we'll move on in case any of the other panel members have something to add. You touched briefly on Chevron's license, which is set to expire in May, late May 27th. Is it your view that Chevron really will be forced out? Will that be the end of its time in Venezuela, or do you anticipate that there may be a little bit of room there, or next steps, or some sort of agreement that could be reached that could be beneficial to the region?
Yeah. Sure. No, look, I think now the ball seems to be in Maduro's side of the camp, no, and I think he needs to give some sort of political concessions to see if there is any possibility of extending that license. No, I think something interesting is the date, the new date that we have for the expiration of the wind down period. No, remember that this license was supposed to expire on April 3rd. No. And it was not extended until May 3rd or June 3rd. It was extended until May 27th, no, which is just 2 days after the legislative and gubernatorial elections that have been scheduled for May 25th. No? So I think the final outcome for that license could be closely associated with what the Maduro regime may end up deciding on the legislative elections. No, I think there is a high chance that they postpone that election. If you see, until now, we don't even know who the candidates for that election are, and we are just 2 months away. No, logistically, it seems practically impossible to conduct that election in minimum acceptable conditions. No, and if they try to do so, actually, so what we could see is an additional escalation of the tensions. No. But if the government postpones that election, and there is already people talking about dates in August or even further down in the second half of the year, in that case, there could be an opportunity to extend a little bit more the wind down period and open the door for some sort of negotiations.
Michael, Luis, anything to add there?
I think I would just say that I'm not convinced yet completely about the Trump administration taking a hard line on Venezuela. I think we've seen some zigzagging between the Rubio-Clavicarón camp that wants a hawkish line, wants to get Maduro out, and the Grenell special envoy line, which is much more keen on cutting deals. And we've seen a bit of zigzagging between the two. And I think it's very significant that the announcement of the tariffs on Venezuelan oil was accompanied by this delay in cancelling Chevron's license, which was sort of slipped out in the bottom of the news with the intention clearly that everybody would focus on the headline about the tariffs, which in my view will almost certainly never be applied to anyone, because I think the oil will be smuggled. As Alejandro mentioned, it'll be smuggled on the black market. It'll be pushed out in shadow tankers that are Iranian or Russian, and it'll be very difficult to trace. So it'll be very hard to impose tariffs on anyone and prove that they actually bought the stuff. But I think what it allowed the administration to do was slip out another month and a bit of time for Chevron to continue. And Chevron, remember, has not shown any signs so far of packing up in Venezuela. And they've been engaged in some very active lobbying of the Trump administration, trying to push buttons on issues like migration and convince the administration that actually triggering big collapse in Venezuela economically is going to be bad for migration to the US. And will make it more difficult for Trump to deport all the Venezuelans he wants to deport from the US back to Venezuela. So for me, the jury's still out on the Venezuela policy. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I'm not convinced 100% that it's going to be this tough line to squeeze out Maduro.
A priority of Trump's presidency has been making cuts to the federal workforce, and we've seen plenty of announcements about the USAID program being hit pretty hard. What is your impression as to the impact of those types of cuts on Latin America?
Who are you asking? Sorry.
It's open to anyone.
Okay. Maybe you mean sort of USAID specifically?
Correct, USAID specifically.
Yeah. Well, personally, my view on this is a bit different, I think, to the consensus, but I was very struck by the fact that I couldn't find a single government in Latin America that lamented the end of USAID. In fact, quite the opposite. Several governments of left and right welcomed the end of USAID. So Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and Nayib Bukele in Salvador all agreed this was a great thing. Oh, and Nicolas Maduro, by the way, too. They all said they thought it was great that USAID was over, clearly for different reasons, for their own political reasons, but they were not lamenting it. And I think it reflects, too, an ambivalence about the origins of USAID in the 1960s as a program very tied up with the Cold War, resisting Soviet influence, a feeling on the left in Latin America that USAID was deployed to assist military regimes at some point, and a sense that there's too much interference in issues where it maybe isn't always appropriate. We can agree or disagree about that, but to me it was quite notable that there was very little said in terms of lamenting. And things like Peru, where there was the anti-narcotics assistance, I think about $135 million of anti-narcotics assistance in Peru. The Peruvians came out very quickly and said, we're going to do that ourselves. We'll pay for that, thank you. Whether they will, I mean, we'll have to see. But the reaction from Peru was, we'll just take that over. In Brazil, USAID was minimal. I mean, it was barely there. It was really not a major impact. So personally, I don't think this is very big. It might have more of an impact in the Caribbean or in some of the smaller Central American countries, but in most of Latin America, I don't think it's going to make a big difference.
This also is for any member of the panel. Do you see any alteration or modification in renewable energy policies and opportunities in LATAM under a more oil and gas focused U.S. administration?
What I would say on that is that the drill baby drill policy in the U.S. is meant to secure more self-sufficiency in energy in the U.S. as opposed to look for new partners. And so you would think that companies or countries in the region, could be looking to, get in some kind of, bandwagon, with the U.S. in terms of, providing more, energy alternatives that, could be more regionally based. But I don't think that is the focus or the interest of the U.S. right now, both in oil and in gas. maybe the time will come, but certainly that doesn't seem to be. I wouldn't read that as an opportunity for Latin America right now. It's an opportunity for Latin America, probably, to do more with China. But then, as Michael mentioned, that has its drawbacks, or to look for other markets, right? Certainly, Europe is still, and there's a question mark as to whether, on the back of Ukraine-Russia ceasefire, there could be renewed, lifting of sanctions and more energy flows coming out of Russia, whether Europe would be once again willing to buy or not. Maybe Latin America could be knocking the door of Europe, say, hey, I could be, a more dependable, reliable supplier, invest here. I don't see that happening right now, though.
Alejandro, Michael, anything to add?
I'd agree with Luis. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I agree.
And the Trump tariffs, with respect to both on auto parts and steel, is it your impression that this is likely to lead to a recession in Latin America?
I already mentioned that under some scenarios, it will be. In the case of Mexico, 25% tariffs on autos. If it gets confirmed, it would certainly push Mexico into a recession, right? And we estimate something in the order of 1% decline, 1.1 to be precise. So yeah, a lot is hanging in the balance here for the concrete announcements next week.
Yeah, I will add there that yes, any of these measures could have an impact on growth for the region, but beyond Mexico, that seems to be the most affected so far. I think steel growth in the rest of Latin is in a relatively good shape. I think at least in our case, we're expecting Latin to grow around 2% this year, and we see several countries in the region actually accelerating. So we're seeing at least a significant recovery in countries like Colombia. Peru also has been outperforming recently growth, and that could still hold even in the current conditions.
I would just add that I was in Brasilia last week, and the word that was used most by the government people I talked to was serenidade, serenity. Brazil is pretty calm, actually, about this, and they don't seem particularly concerned. I think they feel their strengths as a commodity exporter, which tends to attract lower tariffs, and also of very diversified trade relations, not having a trade surplus with the US, but actually a trade deficit, and strong links around the world puts them in a pretty strong position. They're, of course, also exporting a lot more oil, increasing oil production very rapidly. It's something not often talked about, but Brazil is becoming a major world oil exporter, as well as a major food exporter. So if you've got those sort of legs to your economy, then I think you're a lot less concerned about this than, for example, Mexico, which, as Luis quite rightly points out, is going to be by far the worst hit. So there's a very different impact here between Mexico and Brazil.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Michael, you had talked earlier about your belief that perhaps the focus on China being a beneficiary of the Trump administration policies with respect to tariffs and some of the hardening with respect to Latin America might be a bit overinflated. I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit more.
Yes, I think this catches China at a difficult time. China has significantly reduced state-to-state lending to Latin America. In fact, it's virtually stopped. There were some huge Chinese loans about 10, 15 years ago, particular to Venezuela and Ecuador. Those went bad quite quickly. And I think the Chinese drew the conclusion from that it was not a good idea to lend huge amounts of money to Latin American governments because they were unlikely to get it back. So that largely ended. It's been replaced by is a more tactical sort of M&A approach by Chinese companies buying assets, particularly in energy and infrastructure, opportunistically, very often as a result of those assets being put on the market by European or US companies seeking to restructure balance sheets or decrease exposure to the region. And I think that's likely to continue. But the Chinese government has some very serious problems of its own at home. I mean, there's a very sharp slowdown in China. There's huge problems in the real estate market. There's a lot of difficulties China's continuing, and there's real concern in China. I was talking to a Chinese friend last night who lives in Shanghai, and he was mentioning that, you know, that there's real concern in China about the impact these tariffs are going to have on China and on the Chinese economy, on the Chinese economic model. These are the sort of preoccupations of the government in Beijing right at the moment. They're not sort of thinking in expansionary terms. Xi Jinping has already scaled back Belt and Road significantly to a much less expansive scheme. There's less money available for this sort of stuff. And then, you know, finally, as I mentioned, there's already a very big trade dependence between Latin America and China, and within the region, no great desire to increase that further. So I think all of those things sort of add up to China maybe trying to take advantage diplomatically and sort of on a level of argument saying, you know, we're champions of the multilateral system. We believe in rule of law and international trade, which the US doesn't seem to anymore, positioning themselves. But in terms of hard dollars and cents, I think there'll be less perhaps than people believe or might assume.
Thank you. Maria Rosa?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I will add briefly there. No, I totally agree that this change in the financial flows from China into the region is a big change for many countries, and in some cases, I think has increased the need of the region to rely on multilateral organizations. That could be also another channel through which the Trump administration could have a potential impact in the region. No, and there probably I think the perception is that some of the countries that have a closer relationship with this administration, in particular Argentina, Ecuador, if President Noboa is able to get reelected, and maybe El Salvador could also be potential beneficiaries and receive greater financial support that these countries needs.
Thank you, Alejandro. Maria Rosa?
It's really hard to close such an amazing panel. It feels like it could go for much longer, but we try to be punctual. So I'm going to just say thank you so much for sharing your time, for giving us your valuable expertise, and we have really enjoyed this afternoon. And Kelly, thank you for the moderation. It has been great. And Michael, Alejandro, y Luis, thank you so much. Also because it's a huge subject, and you have been able to narrow it down, and thank you for that as well. Before leaving, I'd like to thank our staff, and especially Alexandra Vaquerizo, who is our program director, and our board secretary, Linda Calvet. Stay tuned for more information in upcoming programs, and we look forward to see you again. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.